Hey guys, tonight we begin with a group of men who spent their lives wrestling with nature and occasionally losing fingers to it. The mountain men, those half-wild trappers and wanderers who lived in the frozen heart of North America long before central heating or good decisions existed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The mountain men weren't heroes. They were just the kind of people who saw the edge of the map and thought, let's see what's past that terrible idea. Most were failed farmers, restless veterans, or men who had simply run out of people willing to tolerate them. Civilization was too noisy, too structured, too judgmental, so they packed up their questionable life choices and walked directly into winter. They wandered west during the early 1800s, lured by the fur trade and the promise of riches, though riches mostly meant not starving to death while chasing beavers through waist-deep snow. The job description was simple. Spend 6 months in the mountains, get frostbite, and maybe bring back something worth selling. The average life expectancy was one bad campfire away from zero. There were no hotels, no thermoses, and no weather reports. Just a man, his rifle, and a sneaking suspicion that he'd made an enormous mistake. When the wind howled through the trees at night, it didn't sound poetic. It sounded like the universe laughing. Their relationship with the cold was personal. You didn't fight it, you bargained with it. You built a fire out of frozen wood, huddled near it like a shivering philosopher, and prayed the wind didn't blow sideways. If it did, congratulations. Your only source of warmth just turned into smoke and disappointment. They ate things that would make a raccoon gag. Beaver tail, raw marrow, meat so old it technically qualified as history. Gourmet was anything that didn't crunch when it wasn't supposed to. But the calories kept you alive, and that was all that mattered. And yet, despite the misery, they stayed, because the wilderness had something civilization didn't. Silence. The kind that reminded you how small you were, and how stupid you'd been to come here. It was humbling. Maybe even spiritual. Though mostly it was just cold. Modern people panic when the power goes out for 2 hours. The mountain men would have called that a warm afternoon. They weren't comfortable, or safe, or clean, but they were alive, and in their frostbitten minds, that counted as winning. They weren't built different. They were just built colder. The first thing every mountain man learned, usually the hard way, was that the cold doesn't hate you. It just doesn't care if you live. You can't intimidate it, bribe it, or reason with it. You can scream at the wind all night if you like, but the wind has better things to do. City people today talk about beating the weather by wearing heated jackets or moving to Florida. The mountain men knew better. You don't beat weather, you survive its mood swings. They learned that early, standing in snow up to their ribs, holding flint in one hand and regret in the other. Their relationship with the cold was transactional. You respected it, and it sometimes let you wake up. You got cocky, and it reminded you who owned the landscape. The cold wasn't malicious, it was efficient. It didn't waste energy punishing you, it simply waited for you to make a mistake. They watched new arrivals from the east, fresh-faced dreamers who thought a wool coat was enough. By nightfall, those dreamers were shivering philosophers, contemplating their choices and mortality in equal measure. A veteran trapper could always spot a newcomer by how loudly they cursed the snow. The old hands didn't bother. You only curse what listens. Frostbite wasn't an if, it was a when. Fingers, ears, noses, they all had expiration dates. You didn't complain, you just learned to do everything left-handed. They knew that pain was temporary, but stupidity was fatal. The cold didn't forgive poor planning. When your beard froze solid and your coffee turned to slush before you could drink it, that was just morning. The thermometer wasn't invented for them. They already had a better system. If the whiskey froze, build another fire. If you froze, well, you probably wouldn't repeat the mistake. That's what separated them from the rest of us. We think the cold is an inconvenience. They knew it was a law of nature. They didn't fight it. They adapted until even the frost couldn't tell if they were alive or part of the landscape. Because the truth the mountain men lived by is still the simplest. The cold doesn't care. It just waits. In the mountains, silence isn't peace. It's a warning. The mountain men learned that quickly. You didn't just hear the cold. You rid it. The way your breath hung in the air told you how close death was feeling that day. The world was one long, unbroken whisper. Snow, wind, and the sound of your stomach regretting breakfast. They called it the white silence. Not because it was pretty, but because it was absolute. You could scream into it, and the echo would die faster than a campfire in a blizzard. The mountains didn't care about your feelings. They wanted obedience. Those who didn't listen became headlines in someone else's cautionary tale. Every mountain man knew how to interpret snow like scripture. If it squeaked underfoot, the cold was serious. If it crunched, it was survivable. If it didn't make a sound at all, congratulations, you were in danger. They could smell a storm before it hit, taste the air for ice, and feel pressure drops in their bones. Modern people open a weather app. The mountain men were the weather app. They knew how to walk in snow without sinking, how to build a fire that didn't smother itself, and how to find shelter by reading shadows. You didn't wonder, you observed. A shift in the wind meant a storm was planning something personal. A sudden silence in the woods meant something nearby was considering you for dinner. Even the animals were meteorologists. When the crows flew low, snow was coming. When the wolves went quiet, it was already here. You learned to listen to everything. Trees, birds, your own shivering heartbeat. Modern civilization calls it intuition. The mountain men called it paying attention. They didn't survive because they were tougher. They survived because they noticed. The wilderness was generous to those who respected it, and brutal to everyone else. You can't learn that kind of awareness from a podcast. You learn it by spending 3 nights in a snowstorm, eating frozen jerky, and realizing that nature doesn't do refunds. The mountain men didn't conquer the white silence. They just learned to speak its language, slowly, quietly, and always with frost on their beards. For a mountain man, heat wasn't comfort. It was currency. Every spark, every ember, every half-alive flame was a paycheck from the universe saying, "Congratulations, you get to live another hour." Modern people treat warmth like a human right. Mountain men treated it like a miracle. Their version of turning up the heat involved flint, frozen fingers, and the growing suspicion that God was laughing. Making fire in a blizzard wasn't a skill. It was an argument with nature, and nature always had the better lawyers. They carried tinder like treasure, scraps of bark, dry moss, and bits of cloth that hadn't yet frozen into iron. They knew exactly how long a single log would burn, how fast snow could drown a flame, and how many curses it took before smoke turned into fire. On average, 7. When you finally saw that flicker of orange light through the dark, it felt holy, but fire wasn't just warmth. It was companionship. A campfire was the only voice that answered back. Crackling, hissing, and throwing light into a world that wanted you gone. Sitting near it, wrapped in animal hides, you didn't think about philosophy or poetry. You thought about how long it would last, and whether your boots would catch fire before your toes froze off. The fire taught you efficiency. You learned to cook everything directly on coals. Meat, snow, optimism. You stopped wasting time making coffee because it froze halfway through the pour. You ate it like a popsicle and called it frontier style. They knew that warmth was temporary, fragile, and always earned twice, once with sweat and once with smoke. If you got careless, the wind took it. If you slept too close, the sparks took you. Fire demanded respect, same as the cold. When the night stretched too long and the temperature dropped past the point of argument, the mountain men didn't beg for warmth. They built it. They didn't expect comfort. They created survival. And that's what separated them from the rest of us. We live surrounded by heat and still complain of being cold. They lived inside winter itself and considered it just another evening. To survive the mountains, You didn't need bravery. You needed insulation, both physical and mental. Mountain men discovered early that the best way to stay alive was to dress like a small bear and think like someone who'd already accepted his funeral. They wore layers, not for fashion, but for negotiation. First came the shirt, usually wool, sometimes regret. Then a vest, a coat, and an outer layer of fur so thick it could have legally voted as another person. By the end of winter, most of them looked like furniture that had learned to walk. Washing those layers was unheard of. Soap froze, water froze, even the concept of cleanliness froze. The smell was its own ecosystem, a combination of sweat, smoke, animal grease, and bad decisions. You could track a mountain man long before you saw him. Wolves did. Usually they chose to go in the other direction. Their coats were heavy, their hats ridiculous, and their boots permanently damp. Every garment told a story, mostly about failure. That patch on the shoulder, a close encounter with fire. Those seams near the knees, evidence of a fall that ended in creative cursing. A mountain man's wardrobe was less about style and more about surviving another conversation with the weather. But the layers weren't just fabric. They were armor against madness. When you're weeks deep into solitude and your only conversation partner is your echo, a little weight on your shoulders reminds you that you still exist. The fur, the smell, the constant discomfort. It kept you tethered to the real world, however miserable it was. Modern people talk about winter fashion. Mountain men talked about not dying. They didn't wear designer jackets. They wore whatever hadn't been eaten yet. The fancier trappers might have had fringed coats and moccasins, but under the aesthetics, they were all just cold and smelly philosophers, mumbling about firewood and fate. By spring, when the snow finally melted, they'd peel those layers off like tree bark, revealing the pale, malnourished human inside, blinking, dazed, and wondering why he ever left a warm bed for this life. And yet, as soon as the next winter came, they did it all again. Because survival wasn't comfortable, it was addictive. When it came to food, mountain men didn't eat for pleasure. They ate for thermodynamics. Calories weren't nutrition. They were firewood for the body. If it burned, it worked. If it didn't, you died slightly more poetically. Dinner was whatever didn't kill you first. They boiled, roasted, or occasionally just gnawed on whatever moved slower than they did. Beaver tail was considered a delicacy. Elk tongue was a luxury. The rest of the animal was just fuel with fur attached. If it had fat, it was gold. If it didn't, it was a lesson. The menu changed depending on how desperate you were. In good weeks, you might get rabbit stew. In bad weeks, you might eat the same rabbit twice. Jerky was the main course, dessert, and moral support. It was tough enough to break teeth, which was fine because dental care was just don't die of infection. They hunted in silence, not out of respect for nature, but because chewing too loud could scare away dinner. A missed shot wasn't just a failure. It was a week of hunger, wrapped in regret. They learned to use every part of an animal, bones for broth, hides for shelter, sinew for sewing, and the smell for keeping neighbours away. Salt was worth its weight in gold. You didn't season food to make it taste better. You seasoned it to make it exist longer. The only spice blend they had was desperation mixed with soot. When supplies ran out, creativity took over. They ate their horses, their belts, and once, in truly dire times, the boiled soles of their boots. They called it leather soup. They probably called it other things too, but language tends to break down when you're chewing footwear. There was no farm-to-table movement. Everything was whatever you caught before it froze. Coffee was made from roasted chicory, and whiskey was basically medicine that happened to be fun. Today, people count macros and talk about clean eating. A mountain man's diet was simple. If it kept you warm, it was good. If it didn't, you wouldn't be around to complain. They didn't eat to live well. They ate to keep living, which, in their world, was already ambitious. When the day ended, if it ended, mountain men gathered around the only luxury they had, a small fire that refused to die as stubbornly as they did. That flickering orange glow wasn't just warmth, it was civilization condensed into a circle of smoke, half-burned wood, and questionable storytelling. They didn't talk much during the day. The wind was too loud, the work too constant, and language was mostly reduced to grunts and swearing. But at night, when the snow hissed outside the fire's reach, words started crawling out. That's when you heard the philosophy of men who'd seen too much cold and not enough kindness. They'd sit hunched under furs, beards stiff with frost, staring into the fire like it owed them an explanation. One man would mumble something like, "Ain't nothing colder than regret," and another would nod. Not because it made sense, but because everything made sense after the third sip of whiskey. Firelight made thinkers out of trappers. Every crackle was a sermon, every spark a reminder that warmth was temporary. They'd talk about the things that mattered: women, whiskey, weather, and how all three could kill you if you underestimated them. Sometimes, silence took over, not the polite kind, the kind that pressed against your ribs until you remembered how alone you really were. The fire became a companion, a witness, and in some ways a confessional. It didn't judge, it didn't interrupt, and it burned out just when you needed it most. Every man had a different fire ritual. Some poked it obsessively, as if keeping it alive proved they still could. Others sat perfectly still, hypnotized, like they were staring at the last piece of warmth left in the world. In a sense, they were. Out there, philosophy wasn't about ideas. It was about endurance. You didn't debate the meaning of life. You debated whether your fingers still worked. Enlightenment was a dry pair of socks and a full belly. The fire didn't solve their problems. It just reminded them they still had some. But in that small circle of heat and flickering light, the universe made brief, smoky sense. And that was enough. For the mountain men, sleep wasn't rest. It was a temporary truce with death. You didn't go to bed. You just stopped moving and hoped nothing large, hungry, or cold decided to interrupt. They slept in caves, under trees, or buried in snow like oversized rodents. If you had a fur blanket, you were lucky. If you had two, you were probably sharing them with fleas that had tenure. There were no pillows, no tents, and no such thing as comfort. Comfort was for people who could afford to be warm without earning it. The fire was your roommate, and an unreliable one at that. It either went out too soon or burned too bright and set something on fire, often you. You learned to position yourself so you could wake up before your boots melted, but not before frost formed on your eyelashes. The night air didn't whisper, it chewed. It crawled into your bones like it paid rent. You could wrap yourself in every hide you owned and still feel the cold breathing through the seams. The mountain didn't want you dead. It just wanted to see how close it could get. Sleep came in fragments, stolen between shivers. You might close your eyes for 20 minutes, wake up, feed the fire, curse, adjust your furs, and repeat. Dreaming was risky business, too much of it, and you froze before the sequel. Sometimes, exhaustion made you creative. A snowbank became a mattress, a saddle, a pillow, a half-dead horse, a heated bed, for as long as it lasted. The smell wasn't great, but you stopped caring about aesthetics somewhere around your third frostbitten toe. In the morning, waking up was never a guarantee. You didn't check the time, you checked your pulse. If you could still feel your nose, it was going to be a good day. If you couldn't, well, you'd have less face to shave. They didn't sleep because they were tired. They slept because there was nothing else left to do. The night wasn't for dreaming, it was for surviving quietly, one heartbeat at a time, until the sun decided to try again. For mountain men, sleep wasn't peace. It was a maintenance cycle. In the mountains, your tools decided whether you lived, died, or just wished you had. There wasn't much room for weak metal or weaker men. Every mountain man carried what amounted to a portable hardware store and a death wish, a rifle, a knife, and enough traps to make a psychologist concerned. Their rifles misfired in the cold, their knives chipped on frozen bone, and their traps mangled everything except what they were supposed to catch. Fixing them required a genius-level understanding of cursing. You didn't buy replacements. There were no stores, no mail orders, no friendly blacksmith waiting in the woods. You just fixed it with sinew, bark, or hope, and kept going. A hatchet wasn't a tool. It was a religion. You chopped wood, built shelter, carved stakes, and occasionally used it to express strong opinions. Flint and steel were sacred artifacts, kept close and guarded like a newborn. Losing them meant one thing: learning how long a man could live on raw meat and regret. Leather cord, animal sinew, and frozen rope tied their lives together. Literally. You could spot a veteran trapper by how his gear looked like it had survived a bar fight. Everything was patched, bent, or slightly on fire. If it worked, it was good. If it broke, you called it innovative recycling. But the most important tool they carried wasn't in their hands. It was in their heads. Tolerance. For pain. For hunger. For the general absurdity of existence. A mountain man could lose a finger, burn his hand, and still finish skinning an elk because stopping meant thinking, and thinking led to panic. Modern people panic when their phone battery dies. A mountain man's idea of battery low was running out of bullets, while something with claws was jogging toward him. He didn't overthink, he didn't complain, he just fixed it, or adapted, or accepted that nature was winning on points again. Everything they owned was temporary, borrowed from the land, metal rusted, leather rotted, fire faded, but their patience, that was permanent. Their tools might have broken, but their tolerance never did. And that's the kind of durability no factories managed to reproduce. In the mountains, the body was the only teacher that mattered, and it didn't believe in gentle lessons. You didn't train for the cold, you just suffered until your blood learned the syllabus. Every day was a biology experiment conducted by someone who'd dropped out of school at ouch. At first, newcomers fought the cold. They stomped, cursed, bundled, and complained, as if the weather might eventually apologize. But the mountain men knew better. The body always adapts faster than the brain. The mind screams, "This is insane," while the flesh quietly mutates into something that can sleep on ice and call it refreshing. After a few winters, your skin grew tougher than the leather you wore. Nerves dulled. Pain turned into background noise. You stopped checking if you were bleeding because the answer was usually yes. Fingers became tools, feet became hooves. You weren't a man anymore. You were a semi-domesticated mammal with a drinking problem. They didn't talk about mental resilience, because that required feelings, and most of those froze off long ago. You just kept moving. Your body learned efficiency through punishment. How to breathe slow so your lungs didn't bite back. How to walk without wasting energy. How to sleep without actually relaxing. Cold exposure changed everything. Your metabolism, your sanity, your definition of fine. A veteran trapper could sit in snow for hours, motionless, watching a trapline like a statue made of frost and regret. He didn't fidget. He didn't blink. He'd simply reached enlightenment through hypothermia. The cold carved them into something unrecognizable. The weak became strong, or stopped being a category altogether. Strength wasn't a trait. It was a consequence. They didn't decide to be tough. They just never got around to dying. Modern people call that grit. Mountain men called it Tuesday. Their bodies learned before their minds ever caught up. How to live with pain. How to endure boredom. How to keep going when comfort was just a rumour. And by the time their minds finally understood what was happening, the lesson was complete. The body had already passed the test. The mind just graded it late. Pain, for the mountain men, wasn't a symptom. It was part of the forecast. It came every morning, like frost or bad news. You didn't ask if it would hurt. You just asked what kind of hurt you'd get today. Everything in the wilderness had teeth, claws, or sharp edges, including your own boots. The cold cracked your skin, the wind flayed your face, and every muscle in your body protested like it was trying to form a union. But pain wasn't something you avoided. It was just background noise, like wind or loneliness or wolves arguing over your trash. Cuts got infected, fingers blackened, joints swelled. You fixed it the old-fashioned way, whiskey and denial. If it didn't kill you, it was fine. If it did, at least you didn't have to wake up early anymore. There were no doctors, no bandages, and no sympathy. You cauterized wounds, spat on burns, and kept moving because the snow didn't care that you were having a rough day. Aching bones were badges of honor. Frostbite was practically a handshake. You'd show your blackened toes like trophies, proof that you'd survived another lesson from nature's curriculum. The only thing softer than your body was your mind, and the cold fixed that too. Pain simplified life. It erased luxury, distraction, and introspection. When everything hurts, you stop worrying about philosophy. They didn't complain because nobody would listen. And even if someone did, what was there to say? It's cold. Of course it was. That was the point. Pain was proof you were still alive. Numbness meant you were losing. Modern people call mild discomfort burnout. A mountain man's burnout involved actual fire. Today, we whine about sore backs from office chairs. They slept on frozen dirt and called it chiropractic adjustment. They lived in a constant tug of war between agony and apathy, too cold to feel, too stubborn to stop. Pain wasn't a punishment. It was a reminder. You were still here, still breathing, still annoying the wilderness by refusing to die quietly. In a world that never said sorry, the mountain men learned the oldest truth. Pain isn't the enemy. It's the only honest thing the cold ever gives you. Solitude was the mountain man's roommate. Loud, moody, and always there when you didn't want it. For months at a time, the only heartbeat you'd hear was your own. And even that sounded tired. Out there, conversation was optional, mostly because there was no one left to talk to who hadn't already frozen solid. Your best friends were your horse, your dog, and your rifle, and not necessarily in that order. The horse carried your supplies and judged your decisions. The dog shared your fire and occasionally your dinner. The rifle kept you both from becoming someone else's dinner. It was a healthy, codependent triangle of survival and mild insanity. Men would go entire seasons without human contact, talking to themselves until their own voices started sounding like strangers. You learned to argue with your echo and lose. Loneliness wasn't romantic. It was just another kind of hunger. You started naming things, your traps, your boots, the campfire, because eventually something needed to answer back. Some men cracked under it. The silence was too wide, too endless. They'd start hearing voices in the wind, or swear they saw shapes moving just beyond the firelight. Maybe they did. Or maybe that's just what happens when your social life consists of wolves and ghosts. Animals were the closest thing to companionship. A horse's breath in the cold was the only sign of life some nights. Dogs were priceless. Hunters, guards, heaters, and therapists rolled into one. Lose your dog, and you might as well dig two holes, one for him and one for your sanity. The wild didn't care about your loneliness, but it made you listen differently. You learned to read movement in the trees, to hear mood in the wind. Every sound became a sentence. The forest spoke in whispers, and if you didn't learn the language, you didn't last long. Back east, people measured success in wealth. In the mountains, you measured it in company. A fire that stayed lit, a horse that didn't wander off, and a dog that still wagged its tail when you muttered something stupid. Because when the nearest human was 100 miles away, even a grunt from a mule counted as good conversation. In the mountains, fire wasn't a luxury. It was civilization, sanity, and insurance against turning into a historical curiosity. Every spark was a small miracle, and every man who made one felt like a god for about 5 minutes before it went out again. Lighting a fire in good weather was easy. Lighting one in a blizzard was performance art. You had to fight frozen wood, frozen hands, and occasionally your own frozen optimism. The trick wasn't skill. It was pure stubbornness. You didn't make fire because you thought you could. You made it because dying was less convenient. They carried flint and steel like religious relics. Some kept a coal alive in bark or moss, cradled against their chest through miles of snow. Losing it meant a night of regret and possible cremation, self-administered. Wet wood was an insult from nature itself. You'd curse, shave bark and blow until your lungs gave up before your fire did. When it finally caught, that first flicker of light was holy. Not metaphorically, holy. You didn't look away. You didn't move. You stared at it like it was an old friend who'd come back from the dead. A good fire wasn't just heat. It was company, comfort, and psychological stability in one blazing package. The fire demanded respect. Too small, and it mocked you. Too big, and it tried to kill you. You learned to read flames like moods. The hiss meant damp wood. The pop meant success. The sudden whoosh meant you've just burned your only pair of gloves. Fire turned food edible, fear manageable, and nights survivable. It was a teacher too. Get lazy, and it vanished. Get careless, and it punished. Fire didn't forgive. It just burned. Every mountain man developed his own ritual. Some whispered to it. Others fed it like it was alive. Because in a way, it was the only thing in that frozen world that actually was. When you sat beside it, your back cold and your face burning, you remembered just how fragile warmth really was. Civilization began with fire. Out here, it also ended with it. The mountain men didn't have thermostats. They had survival. And somewhere between then and now, we traded one for the other. We forgot that warmth used to mean effort. That staying alive required more than remembering to pay the heating bill. They didn't fear discomfort. They negotiated with it. The cold taught them patience, humility, and how to build resilience one frozen mistake at a time. We've replaced that with electric blankets and inspirational quotes about getting out of your comfort zone, usually said by people sitting comfortably indoors. They knew the cold wasn't an enemy. It was a teacher that graded on a curve. And failure meant burial. But the lesson stuck. You learned to respect nature because it didn't care about your excuses. These men could predict a blizzard by smell. Most people today need a weather app to find their front porch. They didn't panic when things went wrong. Things always went wrong. You just fixed them or froze. They didn't call it resilience. They called it Tuesday. And they didn't complain because nobody was listening, which, come to think of it, is probably why they got so much done. We forgot the difference between comfort and capability. We've built a world where survival depends on Wi-Fi, delivery apps, and outrage. The mountain men depended on friction, fat, and fire. They worked for every meal, every degree of warmth, every breath of air that didn't freeze inside their lungs. The cold stripped them down until all that was left was the truth. You're not in control. You never were. Nature just occasionally lets you think you are. They didn't romanticize hardship. They didn't call it the simple life. It wasn't simple. It was brutal, lonely, and indifferent. But it was real. What we forgot is that comfort doesn't build strength. It replaces it. The mountain men knew that cold was life's default setting. Everything warm, safe, or easy was temporary, a privilege. And when the fire went out and the frost came creeping back, they didn't curse the cold. They just pulled the blanket tighter and said, "Figures." That's not despair. That's wisdom. By the mid-1800s, the age of the mountain men started melting away, like the snow they'd lived under for decades. The fur trade collapsed, civilization crept west, and with it came railroads, telegraphs, and too many people who thought frostbite was a myth. The wilderness was shrinking, and so were the men who'd built their lives inside it. They didn't die all at once. They faded. Some became guides for settlers, muttering warnings nobody listened to. Others opened trading posts and spent their final winters selling overpriced coffee to people who called it adventure. A few just wandered deeper into the mountains and didn't come back, which frankly was the most poetic option available. The world moved on. Warmth became easy, comfort became normal, and survival became something you did accidentally. The same mountains that once tested men now hosted vacation lodges. The people sitting by those fireplaces never realized they were staring at the ghost of a harder world, a world that demanded you earn every degree of heat. The mountain men understood something modern people still haven't grasped. The cold isn't cruel. It's honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. It doesn't care who you are, what you believe, or how many layers of insulation you can afford. It just asks one question. Can you adapt? They answered that question the only way they knew how, by living long enough to become myths and dying long enough to be forgotten. Their bones became part of the landscape, their names faded into creeks and valleys, and their legacy burned out like the final ember of a campfire left untended. But the lessons remain, buried under every snowfall, whispered in every gust of wind that rattles a cabin door. The cold still speaks the same language. We've just stopped listening. Because somewhere, deep in that frozen silence, the mountain men left behind a truth simple enough to survive extinction. Warmth is temporary, cold is forever. And the difference between the two, that fragile flame between life and oblivion, is still the only thing that ever made us human. Step into a medieval kitchen, and the first thing that strikes you isn't the food. It's the smoke. It rolls and twists like a living creature, curling up from the great open hearth that dominates the room. This isn't your tidy modern stovetop with its polite gas flame. No, this is a fire big enough to roast an entire boar, heat a cauldron the size of a bathtub, and smoke half the family into submission before breakfast. Yet, this smoky chaos was the beating heart of every medieval home, from the peasant's hut to the lord's manor. Here, cooking wasn't just a chore. It was ritual, chemistry, and a touch of witchcraft all at once. The hearth was a place where survival met superstition. Housewives stirred pottage with one hand and crossed themselves with the other, whispering that the pot must turn clockwise or the devil would spoil the meal. A good cook was half magician. She had to coax life from ingredients that were often questionable at best. Bread was sometimes stretched with sawdust. Ale was thick enough to chew. And meat, when you could afford it, had to be smoked or salted to keep the worms at bay. There were no forks, only fingers, knives, and the occasional spoon for soups and stews. A shared bowl meant shared germs, and the idea of clean eating meant wiping your hands on whatever bit of bread or apron was closest. And yet, for all the rough edges, there was artistry here. Spices like cinnamon, pepper, and saffron were rare treasures carried over mountains and deserts by traders who risked their necks to deliver them. To sprinkle imported pepper on your stew was like flexing a Rolex at dinner. The hearth also defined social hierarchy. In grand castles, whole teams of cooks laboured over multiple fires, turning spits by hand, boiling sauces, and baking pies that could feed an army. In peasant cottages, the fire was smaller but just as sacred, a single glowing flame that kept the family warm and alive through the winter. Every ember mattered. In the medieval kitchen, fire wasn't just a tool, it was life itself. It cooked your dinner, lit your night, and tested your lungs' commitment to survival. Every meal in medieval Europe began with a simple truth. What you ate said everything about who you were. The poor man's bowl and the noble's platter told two entirely different stories, and both were seasoned with class, climate, and chance. For peasants, ingredients came from the soil, sometimes grudgingly. Barley, rye, and oats were staples, boiled into pottage thick enough to stand a spoon upright. If it wasn't grey, it wasn't done. Vegetables like leeks, onions, and cabbage grew in kitchen gardens, while herbs such as parsley, sage, and thyme lent flavour to otherwise monotonous fare. Meat was rare and precious, often saved for holidays, weddings, or the occasional chicken that had outlived its egg-laying usefulness. Most peasants would have recognised the taste of salted herring more than roast beef. For the wealthy, however, the kitchen was a theatre of excess. Noble households demanded spectacle, and food was the stage. Swans were roasted whole and redressed in their feathers for dramatic effect. Peacocks were stuffed, gilded, and paraded like edible trophies. The medieval elite loved the idea that a meal could double as a performance, something to remind everyone at the table of their divine right to overindulge. The difference between classes was also measured in colour and spice. Nobles craved saffron for its golden glow, imported pepper for its bite, and sugar for its luxury sweetness, all brought at great cost along the trade routes from Venice, Cairo, and the East. A pinch of spice could mark you as worldly. A dish without it might mark you as poor. Even the humblest cook knew that taste wasn't just about pleasure. It was about power, but there was a practical side too. Food wasn't just eaten, it was preserved like treasure. Salted, smoked, and pickled stores could mean the difference between surviving winter or starving in it. Honey, the medieval sweetener of choice, doubled as medicine and preservative. Proof that nature's pantry could heal as well as feed. In the medieval kitchen, ingredients weren't merely tools of sustenance. They were social currency, tokens of faith, and symbols of fortune. A whole worldview boiled down into whatever fit in your pot. If the medieval kitchen had a secret weapon, it was spice. Not the kind you sprinkle on your fries, but treasures worth their weight in gold. Cinnamon from Ceylon, black pepper from India, and cloves so rare that owning a pouch could make you the envy of a court. These weren't simply seasonings, they were symbols of power, wealth, and sophistication, all carried across continents by traders who risked pirates, plagues, and deserts to deliver flavour. To modern palates, medieval food might seem oddly sweet. That's because sugar was considered a spice too, a dazzling white luxury from the East. Nobles didn't just sweeten desserts, they added sugar to meats, fish, and sauces. A roast might be glazed with honey and dusted with cinnamon, while wine could be boiled with cloves and served steaming to guests as a sign of opulence. The result was a taste world that blurred the line between savoury and sweet. Think turkey leg meets gingerbread. Behind the glamour, though, spices had a darker purpose. They were the great disguisers. In an age before refrigeration, meat often arrived with a personality of its own, and not a pleasant one. Spices could mask the tang of decay, turning questionable cuts into aromatic delicacies. The medieval cook knew this trick well, though they'd never admit it at the feast. But spices did more than hide sins. They also reflected superstition. Medieval physicians believed food affected the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Pepper was hot and dry, ideal for balancing cold diseases. Cinnamon warmed the heart, while saffron supposedly uplifted the soul. So, when your lord sprinkled nutmeg on his pudding, he wasn't just showing off, he was warding off melancholy. The spice trade transformed the medieval world. Venice grew rich as the middleman between East and West. Kings taxed pepper like gold, and cooks, once humble servants, became minor celebrities in noble courts for mastering the mysterious flavours of faraway lands. In the medieval kitchen, spice wasn't a garnish. It was global power ground into powder. Every grain of pepper was a story of conquest, commerce, and culinary ambition. Proof that even in a world without forks, people still hungered for sophistication. Cooking in the Middle Ages was equal parts craftsmanship, improvisation, and controlled chaos. Forget the recipe book. Medieval cooks didn't measure in teaspoons or grams. They measured in instinct, in a good handful, a little while, or until it smells right. And since every fire burned differently, and every pot had its own quirks, two cooks could make the same dish and end up with entirely different results. One delicious, one potentially fatal. The kitchen of a noble household was a living machine powered by people. There were spit boys, often young and unlucky, whose entire job was to sit beside the fire for hours turning meat until it roasted evenly. There were scullions who scrubbed cauldrons black with soot, kneaders who wrestled bread dough like prize fighters, and master cooks who orchestrated it all like generals before battle. Orders flew, pans clanged, dogs loitered for scraps, and the scent of roasting meat mingled with wood smoke and sweat. But for all the frenzy, there was real science. or what passed for it. Cooks were guided by the theory of the humours: balance your ingredients or risk unbalancing the body. If a dish was too cold, like fish or lettuce, it needed heat, perhaps a dash of ginger or a splash of wine. Food wasn't just about taste, it was about keeping your health and your soul in harmony. Still, mistakes happened. Too much salt could ruin a feast. A smoky fire could blacken a whole boar. An undercooked poultry might send an entire noble family running for the privy. There were no thermometers, no timers, no second chances. A good cook's reputation was everything, and one spoiled dish could mean demotion, or worse, a beating from an impatient lord. Yet, when it worked, medieval cooking could be glorious. Pies stuffed with quail and almonds, sauces thickened with bread and wine, pastries filled with figs and honey, all made from scratch, by firelight. It was dirty, exhausting, and often dangerous, but also deeply creative. In the medieval kitchen, chaos was an ingredient, and mastery meant taming it just long enough to serve something fit for both body and spirit. To truly understand medieval cooking, you have to see the contrast between the feast and the famine. On one hand, there were the endless banquets of kings and lords, tables groaning under the weight of roasted boar, almond tarts, and goblets of spiced wine. On the other, there were the lean years when peasants scraped by on watery pottage and stale bread, praying that next year's harvest wouldn't betray them. Feasts weren't just about eating. They were public performances. Every course announced rank and wealth. Nobles didn't simply dine. They displayed power through abundance. A roasted peacock wasn't served because it tasted good. It didn't. It was served because it looked magnificent, feathers reattached and gilded like a trophy in edible form. And while the guests applauded the spectacle, the servants likely dined on leftovers behind the kitchen doors, if they were lucky. At the high tables there was etiquette, of course, though still no forks. Nobles used knives and trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that served as edible plates. The wealthy dined two to a dish, while servants or lower-ranking guests sat further down the hall, often eating the same food, but colder and in smaller portions. The line between nobility and servitude was measured in proximity to the salt cellar, literally. To sit above the salt meant you mattered. Below it, you were decorative at best. For the peasants, dining was less ceremony and more survival. Meals were communal, often eaten from a shared pot in the centre of the table. The portions were simple but sustaining. Barley pottage with bits of turnip or leeks, maybe a scrap of bacon if fortune smiled. Yet even among the poor, the act of eating together was sacred. Food bound the family, the village, the season. Superstition followed every meal. Breaking bread wrong could bring bad luck. Wasting salt was a sin. Eating without saying grace was an open invitation for misfortune or indigestion. The medieval kitchen, whether feeding kings or shepherds, was never just about food. It was about ritual, reputation, and resilience. A performance where every dish told a story of faith, fear, and survival. If medieval cooking had a soul, it lived in its sauces. These weren't mere condiments. They were culinary spells, each designed to transform the plain into the divine. A roast goose without sauce was a wasted opportunity. A fish without it, an act of neglect. Medieval cooks treated sauce-making as an art form, a way to balance the four humours, disguise tough meat, and flaunt sophistication. One of the most beloved was galantine, a thick spiced sauce of breadcrumbs, broth and vinegar, often coloured with blood or saffron. For richer tables, almond milk became a base, crushed almonds mixed with water to create a creamy liquid used in everything from stews to desserts. Almond milk wasn't a modern vegan fad, it was medieval ingenuity, perfect for days when the church banned dairy. Faith and flavour had to coexist somehow after all. Honey sweetened nearly everything. Before sugar became common, honey was the medieval world's gold, drizzled on pastries, mixed into wine, and even smeared on meat. The result was a cuisine where sweetness crept into every corner. To the medieval tongue, a sauce wasn't complete unless it played with contrast, sweet and sour, hot and cool, dry and moist. The eternal balancing act of humours in edible form. Desserts, when they appeared, were theatrical. Jellies shaped like castles, pastries filled with dates and figs, and tarts decorated with nuts and spices dazzled guests who had already eaten more than humanly necessary. Subtleties, as they were called, were edible sculptures, sugar-crafted dragons, marzipan knights, and pies that released live birds when cut open. It wasn't just food, it was bragging rights. Even the humblest cook aspired to master flavour alchemy. Vinegar and verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes, gave brightness to fatty dishes. Herbs from the garden, from mint to hyssop, added layers of aroma that mingled with wood smoke. Every ladle and mortar was a philosopher's stone in miniature, striving to turn the ordinary into something almost sacred. In the medieval kitchen, sauces and sweets blurred the boundary between necessity and luxury. They embodied the cook's greatest ambition, not just to feed, but to enchant. In the medieval world, eating wasn't simply about appetite. It was a moral act governed by the church. Every bite had a place in the great spiritual calendar. What you ate, and when you ate it, could determine whether you were pious or gluttonous, blessed or damned. The medieval year was divided not just by seasons, but by fasts and feasts. Lent alone, 40 days of fasting before Easter, forbade the consumption of meat, dairy and eggs. Advent had similar restrictions. Fridays were fish days, a rule still echoed faintly today. The logic was spiritual, but also practical. By limiting meat, the church preserved livestock and stretched scarce resources. But for cooks, these restrictions were both a nightmare and a creative challenge. Fish became the saviour of the fasting table. Rivers, lakes and coasts teemed with herring, eel and cod. Though by the time it reached the inner continent, the fish might have travelled for weeks, salted into near immortality. In monasteries, inventive cooks found ways to turn fasting meals into gourmet puzzles. They crafted mock meats, fish moulded into the shape of roast birds, or almond milk made to resemble cream. In wealthy homes, fasting was an excuse to flaunt wealth by serving exotic sea creatures like sturgeon or porpoise, considered suitable for Lent because they lived in water. Religion didn't only shape what was forbidden, it blessed what was allowed. Feast days unleashed abundance. Roasted oxen, honeyed breads, and rivers of ale marked holy celebrations. Cooking for a saint's day or a wedding feast was a sacred duty, an act of devotion as much as indulgence. Even the timing of meals followed divine order. Monks ate in silence while scriptures were read aloud, turning dining into meditation. Peasants, meanwhile, prayed before each meal and often left a small portion of bread for the spirits or the poor, because hunger, they knew, was never far away. In a sense, medieval cuisine wasn't ruled by hunger, but by holiness. The church dictated the menu as surely as the seasons did. Every loaf and ladleful reminded people that food was both gift and temptation, nourishment for the body and a test for the soul. Before ovens, there was the hearth, a brutal teacher of patience and improvisation. The medieval kitchen's tools were simple but ingenious, built for a world without timers, thermometers, or temperature control. Iron cauldrons hung from chains over open flames, their contents simmering for hours as cooks adjusted the fire's mood with handfuls of wood. The hearth wasn't just a cooking surface, it was a battlefield where smoke, ash and flame constantly fought for dominance. The tools themselves looked more like weapons of war than instruments of cuisine. Heavy spits turned entire carcasses by hand or by turn-spit dogs, small, long-bodied animals trained to run on treadmills that rotated the meat. Skillets, pans and ladles were forged of iron so heavy they could double as defensive weapons during a kitchen brawl, which, given the stress levels, was always a possibility. Knives were everywhere, but forks were suspiciously absent. The fork, when it finally appeared, was condemned by some priests as a diabolical prong, a vain replacement for the fingers God had given man. Bread ovens, when available, were communal. In many villages, a single massive oven served everyone, each household marking their loaves with a personal symbol to tell them apart. Timing was everything. Too soon, and the oven was too hot. Too late, and your bread turned to charcoal. Cooks learned to read heat the way sailors read wind, by sight, smell, and instinct. Water was drawn by hand, salt was precious, and the concept of clean surfaces was generous at best. The kitchen dog did much of the pre-wash by licking dishes clean, and hands were rinsed in shared bowls before and after meals. Yet, for all the grime and smoke, there was pride in these tools. They connected the cook to a lineage of survival. Faith infused even the utensils. Crosses were etched into bread before baking to ward off evil spirits. Knives were blessed before slaughter. The hearth itself was sometimes sprinkled with holy water on feast days. Every clang of iron and crackle of fire told the same story. Cooking was labour, devotion, and endurance. The tools of the medieval kitchen weren't just instruments, they were relics of human resilience, forged in heat, faith, and hunger. When we think of medieval food today, we often imagine something crude: greasy meat, bland bread, and questionable hygiene. Yet behind the soot and superstition lay the foundations of modern European cuisine. The medieval kitchen didn't vanish with the Renaissance. It evolved, leaving traces in every spice rack, every Sunday roast, and every superstition about what we should or shouldn't eat. The obsession with balancing humours gave birth to the idea of balanced diets. Physicians like Hildegard of Bingen wrote about food's moral and medical properties, foreshadowing the nutritional science we take for granted. The art of sauce making, blending sweetness, acidity, and spice, laid the groundwork for French haute cuisine centuries later. Even the medieval pairing of meat with fruit and sweet glazes survives in dishes like glazed ham or cranberry sauce at Christmas dinner. The spice trade, once the heartbeat of medieval luxury, shaped global economics and exploration. Columbus's doomed shortcut to India. It was about spices. Venetian merchants, North African traders, and Arab navigators all owed their fortunes to the same humble ingredients that once perfumed a medieval stew. Pepper built empires, cinnamon inspired voyages, and nutmeg could start wars. Even dining etiquette has its roots in this smoky past. The shared trencher evolved into the individual plate. Hand-washing before meals became napkins and cutlery. The communal hall turned into the private dining room. Eating became less about surviving the winter and more about performing civilization. Yet, the spirit of the medieval meal, communal, symbolic, and celebratory, still lingers. In the quiet corners of the modern kitchen, you can still hear echoes of that old fire. The stew simmering on the stove, the bread rising in the oven, the clove you crush into your cider, all whisper stories from the Middle Ages. Food was identity then, as it is now, a reflection of class, faith, and imagination. The medieval kitchen reminds us that cuisine is more than sustenance. It's a mirror of its time. In a world ruled by faith and fire, cooks didn't just feed bodies. They fed culture itself. Their legacy endures in every meal that still strives to balance comfort, flavour, and meaning. In the heart of 17th century France, nestled between the Loire River and fields of wheat, lay the quiet town of Loudun, a place that should have been utterly forgettable. Its streets were narrow and cobbled, its churches modest, and its people pious in the way small towns are when the world around them feels uncertain. France was under Cardinal Richelieu's iron rule, and his policies had tightened the noose on local autonomy. Loudun, once semi-independent and Protestant-friendly, was now forced to bow under the growing power of the Catholic crown. The citizens grumbled in private, prayed in public, and eyed each other with a mixture of devotion and suspicion. It was an age when faith and fear walked hand in hand. Demons weren't metaphorical. They were believed to lurk behind every illness, every temptation, every sleepless night. Priests preached of hellfire, Women whispered of witches, and doctors carried more crosses than cures. Loudun's air was thick with incense, gossip, and paranoia, the perfect ingredients for disaster. At the centre of this fragile calm stood the imposing convent of the Ursuline Nuns. Behind its walls lived young women from noble families, sent there to find holiness, or at least to avoid scandal. Their lives were rigidly ordered: prayers before dawn, silence after sunset, and no contact with men except for confession. The convent was meant to be a sanctuary. Instead, it would become the stage for one of Europe's most chilling cases of mass hysteria. The people of Loudun were used to rumours. A missing chicken could turn into a witchcraft tale by nightfall, but even they weren't prepared for what would soon unfold. The screams from within the convent, the reports of nuns writhing on the floor, cursing in voices not their own, and the whispers that a local priest had consorted with the devil himself. In the 1630s, France was obsessed with purity, of body, of faith, and of thought. Anything that threatened it had to be burned out, exorcised, or executed. Loudun would soon learn what happens when a community that fears sin more than truth begins to hunt for evil where none can be found. The demons were coming, but they weren't the kind found in Scripture. At the centre of the Loudun affair stood a man who was as brilliant as he was doomed, Father Urbain Grandier. He was everything a 17th century priest was not supposed to be: handsome, eloquent, arrogant, and dangerously charming. His sermons drew crowds from miles away, not because of divine inspiration, but because people liked watching him command a pulpit like a stage. He spoke with the flair of an actor and the confidence of a nobleman, and even his critics admitted, through gritted teeth, that he was magnetic. Grandier's intelligence was matched only by his defiance. He mocked the church hierarchy, challenged the town authorities, and refused to bow before Cardinal Richelieu's policies. Loudun was one of the few remaining towns with Protestant roots, and Grandier openly defended its independence, a decision that branded him a political nuisance. But it wasn't his politics that would bring him down. It was his charm. Whispers followed him like incense smoke. Women, noble and common alike, sought him out for confession, and many lingered longer than necessary. He was rumoured to have fathered children, seduced widows, and used his pastoral visits for purposes that required no scripture. His enemies, and there were many, waited patiently for the perfect scandal to destroy him. That scandal arrived when the Ursuline nuns came to town. Their new convent needed a spiritual advisor, and Grandier, as the most prominent priest in Loudun, was the obvious choice. But when he refused the position, citing other duties, he inadvertently sealed his fate. The rejected appointment wounded the pride of the convent's prioress, a woman named Sister Jeanne des Anges, a woman whose imagination was as fervent as her faith. Soon after his refusal, Sister Jeanne began to claim that Grandier haunted her dreams. She said he appeared in her cell at night, whispering temptations and caresses, his form both angelic and demonic. Her confessions spread through the convent like wildfire. Within weeks, other nuns began to experience visions too, of Grandier's ghostly visits, of demons crawling through their rooms, of sin disguised as sanctity. A priest had turned into a phantom, a convent had turned into a theatre, and Loudun, already ripe with tension, was about to explode. It began quietly, a few sleepless nights, murmured prayers and nervous laughter behind the convent walls. But soon, something changed. One by one, the Ursuline nuns began convulsing, shrieking, and collapsing in the chapel. They spoke in strange voices, cursed in Latin they were never taught, and claimed invisible hands touched them in the dark. Some rolled on the floor in fits of agony. Others screamed Grandier's name as though he were both their tormentor and their saviour. Sister Jeanne des Anges was the loudest of them all. Her confessions became performances, elaborate, emotional, and strangely captivating. She described how Grandier's spectre entered her cell at night, his face radiant, his words blasphemous. She swore that he led an army of demons into the convent to seduce and corrupt them. She named spirits with grotesque names, Leviathan, Behemoth, Astaroth, and claimed they battled for her soul. At first, the local clergy dismissed it as hysteria or an outbreak of illness, but the behaviour spread too quickly, too dramatically. Within days, nearly every nun was possessed. They clawed at the altar, levitated in fits, and shouted obscenities that would make sailors blush. Witnesses swore they saw impossible things: nuns floating inches above the ground, holy water boiling in its font, and crucifixes trembling on the walls. The convent became a public spectacle. Word of the possessed Ursulines spread beyond Loudun's borders, drawing priests, doctors, and the merely curious. Exorcists arrived by the dozen, armed with relics and holy water, eager to battle Satan himself. The nuns' screams became the town's new soundtrack, but for all the talk of devils, the drama had a distinctly human undercurrent. Many noticed that the possessions grew more theatrical whenever an audience was present. The women seemed aware of who was watching, priests, nobles, or soldiers, and their fits grew wilder, their voices louder. Some fainted dramatically, others claimed to see Grandier's face in the shadows. The church, sensing both danger and opportunity, began to investigate in earnest. If the devil had chosen Loudun, then France needed a victory and a scapegoat. And who better to play the villain than the defiant, unrepentant priest already whispered to have seduced half the town? The stage was set. The exorcisms were about to begin. By 1633, Loudun had transformed into a circus of sanctity and spectacle. The convent's once quiet halls echoed with shrieks, chants, and the metallic clatter of chains. Exorcisms were no longer private rituals, they were public theatre. Crowds gathered outside the convent gates to hear the nuns' screams, and priests conducted their rites with all the drama of a stage performance. Every convulsion, every blasphemy, every cry for deliverance drew gasps and applause from the onlookers. At the centre of the storm was Sister Jeanne des Anges, whose fits grew more extravagant by the day. She twisted her body into impossible shapes, spat out holy water, and claimed to see demons flying above the altar. During one exorcism, she reportedly floated a few inches off the ground, eyes rolled back, mouth frothing. Proof, the clergy said, that Satan had taken residence in Loudun. Jeanne, however, seemed strangely energized by the attention. She began to speak in grand proclamations, calling herself both the bride of Christ and the victim of Grandier's sorcery. Exorcists came and went, each eager to make a name for himself. Father Lactance and Father Tranquil led the rituals with theatrical flair, shouting commands at invisible spirits and interrogating the nuns as though conducting a courtroom drama. "Who sent you?" they demanded. "Urbain Grandier," came the reply, always, inevitably, his name. Demons, it seemed, had remarkable consistency in their accusations. The church's hierarchy began taking notes. Reports of the possessions were sent to Richelieu's agents, who saw an opportunity in the chaos. Grandier had publicly opposed Richelieu's policies. Now, heaven itself appeared to accuse him. What better divine validation for removing a political nuisance than a demonic scandal conveniently tied to his name? Meanwhile, the exorcisms grew darker. The nuns were subjected to hours of prayer, fasting, and physical restraint. Some fainted from exhaustion, others developed wounds they claimed were inflicted by invisible claws. Physicians began to suspect hysteria, but their skepticism was drowned out by the church's conviction. Each new fit became proof of possession, each scream a sermon against sin. By the spring of 1634, Loudun had become a magnet for pilgrims, gawkers, and zealots. The town's faith had curdled into obsession, and far away, Father Grandier could already feel the noose tightening around his soul and his neck. By the time Father Urbain Grandier was arrested in 1634, his guilt had already been decided. The church didn't need proof, it had theatre. The possessed nuns of Loudun had shouted his name too many times to ignore. The priests leading the exorcisms claimed to have extracted signed pacts between Grandier and the devil himself, written in Latin and sealed in blood. The documents were laughably crude, filled with signatures of demons like Lucifer, Leviathan, and even Beelzebub, as if hell had a formal registry. But in 17th century France, logic was not invited to the courtroom. Grandier was dragged in chains through the streets, jeered at by the same townsfolk who once admired his wit and sermons. He maintained his composure, insisting he was innocent, a victim of slander, jealousy, and politics disguised as piety. But Richelieu's agents had already smelled opportunity. The trial became more than a question of faith. It was a chance to crush a local critic of the crown. The machinery of church and state worked together with frightening efficiency. Witnesses came forward in droves, servants, exorcists, even the nuns themselves, each eager to prove their loyalty to God or to save their own skin. Their testimonies bordered on the absurd. They claimed Grandier had flown through the convent's windows, that he had sent demons in the form of black cats, and that his breath alone could corrupt virgin souls. The courtroom, packed with spectators, lapped it up. It was equal parts sermon, spectacle, and witch trial. When the judges presented the so-called demonic contract, Grandier laughed. A fatal mistake. His mockery was painted as arrogance, his confidence as the devil's pride. He was tortured for days to extract a confession, his legs crushed between wooden boards as priests demanded repentance. Yet even in agony, he refused to admit to witchcraft. "I am guilty only," he said, "of having offended powerful men." But reason had no place in Loudun anymore. The verdict was predetermined, and the execution date was set. The priest who once stood in the pulpit preaching salvation was now condemned as the devil's mouthpiece. Loudun had found its scapegoat, and France, its holy victory. On August 18th, 1634, Loudun gathered to witness what was billed as a divine victory, the burning of Father Urbain Grandier. The town square had been transformed into a holy stage. Soldiers kept order, priests led hymns, and merchants sold food to the swelling crowd. Everyone wanted to see the devil's servant perish. The irony, of course, was that the only fire born of hell that day was the one lit by human hands. Grandier, gaunt and broken from torture, was brought out in chains. His legs were crushed, his body bruised, yet his face remained eerily composed. Eyewitnesses said he looked more like a martyr than a sorcerer. The executioners offered him one final chance to confess, to beg forgiveness and name accomplices. He refused. Instead, he prayed aloud for mercy on those condemning him, insisting that his soul was innocent even if his body was not. Before the flames were lit, one of the exorcists, Father Lactance, attempted to bless the fire, shouting for the demons to depart. But according to some accounts, he died screaming a few weeks later, as if cursed by the very act. The crowd watched as the priest's robes caught fire, smoke curling into the sky like incense. Some said they saw a white dove escape from the flames, the soul of Grandier ascending. Others said the smoke formed the shape of a mocking grin. When it was over, the ashes were scattered, and the church declared victory. The demons had been expelled, the witch destroyed, and Loudun purified. But the air didn't feel cleansed. It felt hollow. The nuns' fits continued sporadically, even after Grandier's death, their supposed deliverance proving as elusive as their demons. Outside of Loudun, whispers began to spread. Some priests quietly questioned the trial's fairness. Physicians spoke of hysteria and manipulation. And even the king's court, once eager to please Richelieu, grew uneasy about the spectacle. Grandier's execution was meant to silence scandal. Instead, it immortalized it. He died proclaiming innocence, burned by a church that mistook politics for exorcism and faith for fire. And in the flickering light of his pyre, Loudun's demons didn't vanish. They only changed faces. When the flames died down, Loudun expected peace to return. Instead, a strange silence settled over the town, the kind that comes after hysteria has eaten its fill. The nuns, supposedly liberated from their demons, continued to twitch, convulse, and shriek during prayers. The exorcisms didn't stop. They merely lost their urgency. Without Grandier to blame, the chaos felt hollow, almost rehearsed. The church had destroyed its scapegoat, but the sickness of belief still lingered. Sister Jeanne des Anges, the prioress who had first accused Grandier, became something of a celebrity. She travelled across France, recounting her ordeal as both victim and saint. Crowds gathered to hear her describe how Satan had possessed her body, and how the Virgin had freed her soul. She even claimed to bear invisible stigmata as proof of her divine suffering. The church rewarded her piety with public admiration, the very fame she seemed to crave all along. Yet, in her private writings, Jeanne admitted to haunting dreams of Grandier, not as a demon, but as a man whose face she could not forget. Guilt, perhaps, or something darker. For Loudun itself, the scandal was a curse that never faded. Trade dwindled, pilgrims stopped coming, and the town's name became synonymous with madness. The ashes of the priest had poisoned the soil of faith. Even years later, travellers avoided Loudun, whispering that it was still haunted, not by devils, but by the collective sin of its people. In Paris, scholars and skeptics began to whisper a different theory. Physicians like Gabriel Naudet suggested the nuns' behaviour was not demonic at all, but psychological, a frenzy born of repression, isolation, and suggestion. The idea was radical, even blasphemous, but it hinted at something modern: mass hysteria, centuries before psychology gave it a name. Cardinal Richelieu, satisfied with his political victory, moved on. Loudun had served its purpose, one heretic silenced, one lesson delivered. But France would never quite forget the episode. The possessions of Loudun became a stain on the church's robe, proof that faith, when mixed with fear, can devour itself. In the smouldering aftermath, the question remained: who had truly been possessed, the nuns or everyone who believed them? In the years that followed, Sister Jeanne des Anges transformed from scandalous accuser to near saint, a living relic of the Loudun miracle. Her fame spread far beyond the convent walls. Nobles, bishops, and even the king himself summoned her to court, eager to witness the woman who had wrestled with demons and lived to tell the tale. She relished the attention. Her limp, the result of demonic torment, became part of her holy persona, and she described her suffering with the confidence of an actress who knew her audience adored every word. At each appearance, Jeanne recounted her visions in detail: Satan's seductive whispers, the grotesque faces of the spirits that clawed at her, and her eventual triumph through faith. But her stories were fluid, embellished, evolving with every retelling. The demons became more monstrous, the miracles more vivid. When skeptics questioned her, she accused them of harbouring hidden devils. It was a clever tactic. Doubt itself became proof of sin. Her newfound celebrity gave the church a convenient narrative. Jeanne was the emblem of divine victory, the church triumphant over Satan, the fragile female saved by holy authority. She was paraded as proof that exorcism worked, that evil had been conquered. Yet behind her pious facade, Jeanne was haunted. In her private confessions, she admitted to nightmares of Father Grandier, appearing not as the demon she had once described, but as a wounded man, burning, silent, and accusing. She would wake trembling, torn between triumph and guilt. Some contemporaries saw through the spectacle. Writers and scholars whispered that Jeanne's fame was nothing more than a mask for political theatre. They saw in her miracles the reflection of an entire nation's madness, a France where repression and religion danced on the same tightrope. But few dared to say it aloud. In her later years, Jeanne claimed to have been granted another miracle, a healing of her paralysis after a pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Francis de Sales. Whether it was divine intervention or psychosomatic relief, she took it as a sign that her holiness was confirmed. Sister Jeanne died peacefully, cloaked in reputation, yet surrounded by ghosts, one of them forever whispering her name in smoke and fire. The cult she inspired outlived her, a monument to hysteria, sanctified as faith. Centuries later, the story of the possessed nuns of Loudun still haunts Europe's imagination. A perfect storm of faith, fear, and forbidden desire. What happened in that small French town in the 1630s wasn't just an outbreak of hysteria. It was a mirror held up to an age when religion and politics were indistinguishable, when women's bodies became battlegrounds for belief, and when the line between the sacred and the obscene blurred beyond recognition. Historians have long debated what truly occurred. Some argue the possessions were a collective psychological crisis, the product of repression, isolation, and the suggestive power of authority. Others insist it was political theatre, engineered by Richelieu's agents to eliminate a defiant priest. And then there are those who believe the nuns were victims of something deeper, the intersection of genuine belief and human need for meaning in chaos. Whatever the cause, Loudun remains a study in how fear, once sanctified, becomes unstoppable. Father Urbain Grandier's name endured as both villain and martyr. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire later cited his trial as proof of the Church's cruelty and superstition. In the 20th century, his story was reborn through plays, operas and films, from Aldous Huxley's The Devils of Loudun to Ken Russell's infamous 1971 adaptation, The Devils. Each retelling stripped away another layer of myth, revealing the same uncomfortable truth, that reason collapses easily when dressed in holy robes. Sister Jeanne des Anges, meanwhile, remains a symbol of contradiction, part saint, part manipulator, part victim of her own creation. Her diary survives, filled with ecstatic visions and agonized remorse. Some see her as the first documented case of psychosomatic possession. Others as a tragic woman trapped by the expectations of a faith that demanded either purity or perdition, with no room between. Today, Loudun's ruins still whisper their story. Tourists visit the spot where Grandier was burned, now marked by a simple plaque. The convent is long gone, but the echo of its screams lingers in every account. The case of Loudun reminds us that hysteria doesn't require demons, only fear, power, and a willing audience. And perhaps the most terrifying lesson of all, that belief, once inflamed, can burn brighter and crueler than any fire ever lit in that doomed French square. In medieval Paris, sin and salvation lived side by side, separated only by the width of a street. The same city that built towering cathedrals also built an underground network of desire, one hidden behind the scent of fresh bread and cheap wine. By day, monks walked the cobbled lanes chanting psalms. By night, the same stones echoed with laughter, whispers, and the rustle of cloaks slipping into forbidden doorways. Paris was Europe's beating heart, crowded, chaotic, and intoxicating. Merchants shouted prices in the market, students from the Sorbonne debated theology, and beggars waited by the bridges for coins or confessions. Yet behind this noisy respectability, another economy thrived, one that traded not in gold or grain, but in pleasure. Hidden between bakeries, taverns, and wine cellars were the maisons closes, discreet brothels known only to those who could afford sin and silence. They weren't marked by any signboard or lantern. A flicker of candlelight in an upstairs window, a curtain drawn twice, or a loaf of bread left intentionally uncut could serve as the signal. For those in the know, Paris was a map of temptation, drawn in invisible ink. The church thundered from the pulpit that lust was mortal sin, yet Parisian priests walked past these brothels every day. They denounced vice in sermons, then quietly blessed the men who profited from it. The truth was, the city's moral order depended on its hidden sins. Brothels were the pressure valves of a society obsessed with purity, places where men could indulge what the church forbade, and then return to confession cleansed and ready to sin again. To a foreign visitor, Paris might have seemed holy, a city crowned by Notre Dame and ruled by devotion. But those who lived there knew better. Behind every convent was a tavern, behind every chapel, a bed for rent. Knights, merchants, and clerks of the church all walked the same narrow alleys after dusk, their armour or robes traded for anonymity. The brothels of medieval Paris were not just dens of desire, they were mirrors. In their candlelight flickered the hypocrisy of an age that worshipped chastity, but lived off temptation. Sin was not the city's secret, it was its second heartbeat. The women who lived and worked in the brothels of medieval Paris were ghosts in daylight and queens at night. Society called them sinners, but in the dim glow of tallow candles, they ruled small kingdoms of their own making. Most had not chosen this life. It had chosen them. Poverty, war, and hunger drove countless women to the city, and Paris, for all its grandeur, offered few options. A woman without a husband, family, or trade was invisible, unless she sold what men most desired and most despised. Some came from the countryside, fleeing famine or the shame of bearing a child out of wedlock. Others were widows or wives abandoned by soldiers who never returned. For many, the brothel was less a moral fall than an act of survival. There, at least, they had food, warmth, and a roof, privileges not guaranteed to the respectable poor freezing outside. Inside the maison close, life had its own rules. Older women became maitresses, madams, running the business with sharp tongues and sharper minds. They handled accounts, paid guards for protection, and negotiated discreetly with city officials who pretended not to notice. Many were wealthier than the merchants who sneered at them in public. In an age when women couldn't own property legally, madams found creative ways to do so, through fake names, male intermediaries, or church loopholes quietly ignored. For the younger women, the work was dangerous but not entirely hopeless. Some saved enough to escape the trade, marry, or open small taverns. Others succumbed to illness, violence, or exhaustion, their names recorded only in tax rolls and parish ledgers. Despite their reputation, many prostitutes were surprisingly well connected. They heard secrets whispered by knights, priests, and clerks, secrets that could destroy reputations. Some used this knowledge as protection, others as quiet revenge. In a way, they held a power most virtuous women could never imagine, the power of knowing men as they truly were. Behind every veil and painted face was a story of survival, women who learned to navigate hypocrisy better than any bishop or baron. The church damned them, men desired them, and Paris depended on them. They were outcasts, and yet somehow indispensable. When night fell over medieval Paris, its narrow streets filled with men seeking what daylight forbade. They came cloaked and hooded, muttering prayers one moment and knocking softly on shuttered doors the next. The customers of the Parisian brothels were a cross-section of medieval society, a parade of sinners united by desire. Knights fresh from battle, merchants heavy with coin, university students drunk on wine, and even the occasional monk, all slipped into the city's underworld with the same guilty heartbeat. The nobility were the most predictable visitors. A knight could fight bravely by day, then spend his spoils on indulgence by night. Chivalry demanded that he honour women, but only certain kinds. Courtesans were safe sin, neither wives nor virgins, existing to absorb the lust that polite society denied. Many knights developed favourite houses, where their gold ensured discretion and familiarity. Some even treated the women as confidants, whispering gossip about noble feuds or military campaigns between kisses. Merchants, too, were frequent patrons. Prosperous men from the markets of Les Halles or the docks of the Seine often sought relaxation after counting coins all day. Brothels near the river did brisk business, where wine flowed freely, and conversation mixed easily with commerce. Deals were sealed over embraces, debts forgiven over laughter. For the merchant class, pleasure was another kind of transaction, one they could afford. But the most controversial visitors were the clergy. Priests and friars, sworn to chastity, were often among the most loyal clients. Some came in disguise, others openly, claiming spiritual guidance for the women. The hypocrisy was no secret. Even chroniclers joked that half the city's holy men kept private ministries in tavern backrooms. Yet the church turned a blind eye, preferring sin behind closed doors to scandal in the streets. The brothel was a strange equalizer. A nobleman and a beggar might share the same wine jug or the same woman, both shedding their identities for a few hours of anonymity. When morning came, they'd vanish into the city's mist, each pretending the night had never happened. In medieval Paris, sin was democratic. Every man, regardless of title or robe, walked those alleys eventually, and every one of them paid the same price: silver for pleasure and silence for survival. Officially, the church of medieval Paris thundered from the pulpit that lust was the gateway to hell. Unofficially, it managed the traffic. The same institution that condemned brothels also taxed them, inspected them, and quietly ensured their survival. To the moral eye, prostitution was sin. To the practical one, it was civic necessity. And few organizations in history have been as skilled at balancing holiness with hypocrisy as the medieval church. The logic was delightfully twisted. Church authorities claimed brothels were a lesser evil, a way to prevent greater sins like adultery, rape, and sodomy. A controlled outlet, they argued, kept men from corrupting respectable women. Thus, the trade of sin became, in the church's eyes, a form of moral plumbing, diverting lust away from the sacred and toward the expendable. Brothels were not blessed, but they were tolerated, managed, and, crucially, taxed. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries show that Parisian clergy collected rent from houses of ill repute, often through intermediaries to maintain plausible deniability. Some convents even owned properties later leased to madams, a convenient arrangement where holy funds and sinful profits mixed seamlessly. The bishop's office, meanwhile, ensured the women were registered and examined for cleanliness, not out of compassion, but to maintain public order and prevent disease outbreaks among wealthy clients. The papacy periodically condemned this hypocrisy, but only when politically convenient. In 1254, King Louis IX tried to abolish brothels altogether, calling them an affront to Christian virtue. Within a year they quietly reopened, this time under new management, often municipal officials working in cooperation with church wardens. The king may have worn a halo, but the tax collectors knew where salvation really came from. Confession also played its part in this double game. A priest might hear a man's sins on Sunday, then accept a discreet donation on Monday from the same establishment that caused them. Redemption, it turned out, was available for a modest fee, payable in coin, not repentance. The church may have claimed to guard the gates of heaven, but in medieval Paris it also leased rooms on the road to hell. Its sermons damned lust, yet its ledgers depended on it, and no one dared call it blasphemy, because everyone was profiting. Step beyond the heavy wooden door of a Parisian brothel, and you entered another world, one that smelled of candle wax, cheap perfume, and spiced wine. The noise of the streets vanished, replaced by laughter, whispers, and the slow strumming of a lute. Inside, sin had etiquette, and pleasure had a schedule. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Each brothel had its own rhythm. In the front room, guests were greeted by candlelight and wine. The madam, usually seated by the hearth like a queen of shadows, sized up every man who entered. She knew at a glance who would pay well, who would haggle, and who needed a lie whispered in his ear. Behind her, the girls waited, some shy, others bold, each performing a delicate dance between seduction and survival. Rooms upstairs were small but carefully arranged. Silk was rare, but soft linen, flowers, and incense created the illusion of luxury. Mirrors, a true extravagance in the Middle Ages, were sometimes hung near the bed, a novelty meant to dazzle the wealthy and distract from the creaking floorboards. The sound of laughter drifted down the stairs, mingling with the creak of boots and the occasional prayer from a man who couldn't decide whether he was sinning or confessing. Food and drink were part of the performance. Jugs of wine were served to loosen tongues, and platters of roasted meat or honeyed cakes offered the illusion of a feast. Musicians played softly, knowing their melodies helped blur the line between pleasure and penance. For a few hours the brothel became a kingdom without judgment, a refuge for men escaping the pressures of faith, marriage, or war. But beneath the surface shimmered exhaustion. The women worked long hours, often serving a dozen clients in a night. Disease was an ever-present threat, as were violent patrons. The madam's job wasn't only to count coins, it was to keep the peace, to protect her workers, and to bribe guards when trouble brewed. Despite the hardship, these places had an odd sort of community. There were birthdays, laughter, even friendships. In a city obsessed with sin, the brothel was paradoxically honest. No pretense, no masks of holiness. Just desire, survival, and the quiet understanding that both could exist in the same room. Medieval Paris didn't leave its vices entirely to chance. Even sin required paperwork. Brothels operated under a tangle of city ordinances and ecclesiastical permissions that turned moral contradiction into bureaucracy. The church damned them, the crown licensed them, and the city taxed them, sometimes all in the same week. The regulations were surprisingly detailed. Prostitutes were forbidden to live near churches, to wear certain colours, or to appear in public during religious festivals. Scarlet or striped garments marked them as women of the trade, a badge of shame that also functioned as advertisement. They couldn't enter markets until late morning, when respectable wives had finished shopping. Even their funerals were controlled, no burial in consecrated ground, unless a priest vouched for repentance. And yet, despite this web of restrictions, the city kept meticulous records of their earnings. Tax collectors, conveniently blind to morality, made regular visits to inspect the premises. Brothels paid fees for operation, for security, even for window candles, the little flames that signalled business was open. In return, the women received a measure of protection. Guards patrolled their districts, and violent clients could be punished by law, not because of justice, but because disorder threatened revenue. Still, hypocrisy reigned supreme. During Lent or major feasts, authorities performed moral purges, closing houses of pleasure with theatrical zeal. Yet everyone knew the closures were temporary. The same officials who padlocked doors in March quietly reopened them in April after collecting reinstatement fees. The church might have thundered about sin, but the city's coffers depended on its continuation. Punishment, when it came, was selective. A poor prostitute might be flogged or paraded through the streets for public shame, while a wealthy client faced little more than a fine or a discreet confession. If a priest or monk was caught, the church handled it internally, which usually meant exile to another parish and a strongly worded sermon. What emerged from all this was a grim paradox. Prostitution was illegal, immoral, and indispensable. Paris needed its brothels as much as it needed its bakeries. The law might have claimed to govern sin, but in truth, it only managed it, ensuring that vice flowed smoothly, quietly, and profitably through the veins of the holy city. To understand the brothels of medieval Paris, one must first understand their geography, a map of sin tucked neatly into the city's anatomy. Pleasure had its own districts, its own economy, and even its own boundaries approved by those who pretended it didn't exist. Paris was not built in innocence, it was built in layers, holy on the surface, carnal underneath. The main artery of this hidden world ran through the left bank, near the university quarter of the Sorbonne. Students, restless and poor, filled the taverns of Rue de la Harpe and Rue Saint-Jacques, where bakeries and wine-houses offered more than bread or Bordeaux. Their upper floors were discreetly rented to women of good humour, a euphemism that fooled no one. There, theology students debated morality by day and tested it by night. Closer to the Seine, the district of the Cité pulsed with another kind of trade. Boatmen, sailors and merchants found cheap companionship near the bridges. The Pont au Change and Pont Saint-Michel were unofficial gateways to lust. Candle-lit rooms overlooked the water, and the smell of the river mingled with incense and sweat. Some of the oldest brothels stood on barges moored to the banks, floating dens of pleasure that drifted just outside the reach of the city's moral patrols. But the most infamous quarter was the Rue du Poirier, near the old marketplace of Les Halles. Here, the lines between tavern, inn, and brothel blurred completely. Loud laughter, dice games, and drunken songs filled the night. The church called it the Devil's Orchard. The city called it profitable. Each neighbourhood had its own clientele. The left bank drew students and clerics, the river, merchants and travellers, Les Halles, labourers and soldiers. It was a social ecosystem of vice, where gold determined discretion. The rich found luxury behind shuttered windows, the poor settled for alleys and back rooms. Ironically, the brothel map often mirrored the sacred one. For every church, there was a tavern. For every monastery, a house of pleasure. The proximity wasn't accidental. Where the church built to control desire, desire built to mock it. And so, beneath the spires of Notre Dame, Paris whispered its truest prayer. Forgive us, for we will sin again. Nowhere was the hypocrisy of medieval Paris more glaring than in the confessional. The church condemned lust with fiery sermons, yet many of its own clergy were the most devoted customers of the very houses they damned. To the priests of Paris, temptation wasn't just an occupational hazard, it was practically part of the job description. Young clerics studying at the Sorbonne roamed the city at night in their robes turned inside out, pretending to be scholars while seeking earthly instruction. Confessors who heard the sins of their flock often returned to commit the same ones, sometimes in the same brothel. Chronicles record priests caught in compromising situations, yet punishment was rare. The church, ever protective of its image, preferred to move a sinner to another parish rather than expose him to public scandal. Some clergy rationalized their behavior with absurd theology. They argued that by experiencing temptation firsthand, they could better understand and absolve it in others. Others called it a mercy. Better they sin with a fallen woman than defile a virgin. The logic was appalling but effective. The pulpit stayed occupied, the brothel stayed open, and the tithe stayed steady. Certain brothels even specialized in clerical clientele. Located near churches and monasteries, they offered discretion, fine wine, and women skilled in flattery rather than romance. The madams knew to keep names off the books and mouths shut. A single indiscretion could ruin a priest's career, or worse, reveal the church's comfortable complicity. The line between confession and seduction blurred. Some women described priests asking them to reenact temptations of the flesh so they could resist them, a rehearsal of virtue that ended predictably in sin. Others were asked to repent alongside their customers in whispered parody of absolution. The sacred and profane shared the same bed. Yet the church's hypocrisy served a purpose. By quietly managing vice, it controlled it. Better to own the brothels in spirit than let the devil profit unchecked. And so, the holy city of Paris lived a double life. Prayers at dawn, indulgence at dusk. The priests preached purity, but the streets told a different sermon, one written not in scripture, but in sighs behind shuttered windows. By the late 15th century, the secret brothels of Paris had begun to lose their protection. The Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and waves of religious reform changed how the city viewed sin. Where once lust had been tolerated as a necessary evil, it now became a symbol of divine punishment. Plague was blamed on moral decay, and women of the trade were branded not just as sinners, but as walking contagions, the physical embodiment of the city's corruption. As fear spread, reformers demanded purification. Brothels were raided, madams imprisoned, and women publicly flogged through the streets. King Charles VII ordered several red-light districts closed, declaring that the city must no longer serve both God and the devil. Of course, sin does not vanish when outlawed. It merely changes its address. The wealthy found ways to continue discreetly in private homes or behind tavern doors. For the poor, the trade grew harsher, moving from regulated houses to the filth of alleys and riverbanks. The church, which had once profited from the business, turned on it with sudden ferocity. Sermons thundered about fallen daughters of Eve and the harlotry that defiled Christendom. Yet even as officials closed brothels, confessionals stayed full. The moral cleansing of Paris was less about holiness than optics, a performance of virtue in a city built on contradiction. Some women vanished into convents, their sins exchanged for prayers. Others died nameless, their stories erased by the same institutions that once taxed them. The madams who survived often reinvented themselves as innkeepers or herbalists, their knowledge of men's desires replaced by knowledge of their ailments. And yet, the memory of those brothels never truly disappeared. Beneath the cobblestones of modern Paris lie the remains of cellars where laughter once echoed and candles once flickered in defiance of shame. The church pretended to forget them, but the city did not. Their legacy lingered in its slang, its literature, and its endless fascination with the boundary between sin and survival. The secret brothels of medieval Paris were never just places of pleasure. They were reflections of a society at war with itself. A city that built cathedrals to save souls also built rooms to tempt them. And in that contradiction, Paris found its truest identity: sacred, sinful, and eternally human.